Welcome to the Human Rights Café. My name is Jacob Sule. When people's rights are tampered with or denied, it means that my rights and yours are being undermined. Hence, we must educate people about their rights. The Human Rights Café is a collaborative virtual conversation of a Right to Live initiative to equip new generation of leaders to know, promote, and protect citizens' rights and dignity of all persons. The conversation seeks to promote human rights, justice, peace, and strong institutions as provided for by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Our goal is to build a nation where peace and justice shall reign and respect for citizens' rights. If you'd like to know more about the Human Rights Café, please join our conversation on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter via @HRightsCafe. Once again, Jacob Sule. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Human Rights Cafe show today. This is a Human Rights Cafe streaming live from Washington, D.C. in the United States. My name is Jacob Sule, and I have two guests with me today who will discuss the issues of human rights and humanitarian law violations around the world, looking at perspectives from Ukraine. I have two gentlemen with me in the studio whose name are Pietro. Pietro, it's a pleasure to have you. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
I also have another gentleman whose name is Gabriel Ortiz. Gabriel, it's a pleasure to have you. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, today's conversation will focus on the international humanitarian law, violations and its prosecutions, historical perspectives, and the war in Ukraine. As we all know, generally, when violations occur in international humanitarian law, states are under obligation to prosecute alleged offenders. Domestic courts therefore plays an important role in the enforcement in IHL and limiting impunity. In addition to national jurisdictions, violations of international humanitarian law can be prosecuted by various international criminal tribunals. Violations such as using humans as shields and movement of civilians to make alleged offenders of war crimes immune from military operations are bad. Today, I have Pietro. Pietro is an Italian student. Pietro is an Italian lawyer who graduated from Bocconi University Law School in Milan, Italy. He's completed his master's degree in law with focus on international law, and he was chosen to participate in a merit-based exchange program at the Arizona University. He's also now a legal intern at the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children, working specifically with the Coons Family Institute on International Law and Policy, the research branch of the organization. And Pietro is currently pursuing his master's in law at the American University, focusing on human rights and humanitarian law. Welcome, Pietro, once again.
Thank you.
I also have in the studio with me today Gabriel Ortiz. Gabriel is a Venezuelan lawyer who graduated from Universidad Católica Andrés Bello. He completed his diploma in economic, social, and cultural rights at the University of Buenos Aires with outstanding mentions in investigating issues regarding participation in relation to the economic, social, and human rights. In 2017, Gabriel won the first place in a competition held at the headquarters in the Inter-American Court in Costa Rica. Gabriel is currently an assistant professor in international law, visiting professor at the Inter-American Institute of Human Rights in Costa Rica. He is a volunteer student working with American University Washington College of Law Human Rights Academy, and Gabriel is a legal advisor to the Permanent Mission of Venezuela before the Organization of American States. Gabriel is an outstanding human rights activist, and it's a pleasure to have you on the show today. Thank you and welcome, Gabriel.
Thank you again, Jacob.
Gabriel, you have a rising career in international human rights law. Can you tell me how you started your career in international humanitarian law and how has been the journey so far as an international lawyer?
That's a great question. I actually started my involvement in international humanitarian law in 2016, I think. As you said, I was part of a team that represent my university back in Venezuela before a moot court competition about human rights within the Inter-American system of human rights. So basically, the topic of the moot court in that occasion was precisely the interplay relation that exists between human rights and international humanitarian law. And that's when I really began this interest for IHL. And after that, I have been working in, especially due to the context in my country, focusing in international transition and peaceful transition of power, looking forward to apply international standard of post-conflict situation and how to apply some rules of IHL in some situations that has been suspicious in Venezuela that could actually apply. So that's basically my starting point. I'm really happy to be here with you today, Jacob, and with Pietro. Both of you are my friends on the court of Professor Goldman in international humanitarian law, and that's basically the pathway. I also have some experience. I'm about to finish an article between on talking about the interplay of IHL and human rights in a journal back in Venezuela, and my writing right now in my Goldman class, it's about precisely this interplay.
Right. Thank you so much. Gabriel, today we're looking at a very interesting topic, which is on international humanitarian law violations and its perspectives, and particularly issues in the war in Ukraine. My first question would be to you, knowing fully well that you have a rich expertise in this field. Tell us, what kind of violations could happen in the context of international humanitarian law? Gabriel?
Yeah, that's a great question because when you review the Geneva Convention, there is no like an enforcement body in contrast to what you could see on the Rome Statute that you have directly International Criminal Court, or in the case of the human rights body that you have the regional courts or the universal mechanisms that are in the Human Rights Council and other international bodies that actually has in their machinery these bodies that can enforce the provision of those treaties. There is not such thing directly in the Geneva Convention, and basically the one who has doing that job, but not as a court and neither as a commission, is International Red Cross Committee. What I will say is that because of the existence of those two approaches, we have the human rights vision and the international criminal law vision. So we have those two branches of law that actually help IHL to be effective. And it's funny because the Geneva Conventions are the only treaties in the world that has an universal ratification. All the state members of the United Nations, including the observers members as Palestine and the Vatican City, and also the Cook Islands, are has ratified the Geneva Convention. So, how it is possible to not have a body that ensure the enforcement of those provisions? I will say that the violations has been described, for example, in the Rome Statute in the first part of Article 8 when it's talking about war crimes. You have a direct relations with the Geneva Convention of 1949. Well, the Rome Statute actually talks about the situation in which you can see a violations. For example, extensive destruction and appropriation of property, torture and inhuman treatment, all of them are grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, and that will count as a violation.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. There are several issues of violation, just like you've said, and all that. As a legal practitioner and lawyer by training in Venezuela, do you think the IHL, that is the International Humanitarian Law, has been helpful in the fight against impunity from different countries and all of that? What's your thoughts on that?
I really love that question because actually, when we have been preparing our presentations in our IHL course here in WCO, we review a debate that took place in 2015 that was organized by the International Center for Transitional Justice. And they had a debate on that question on if the international community abandoned the fight against impunity. And we have in that conversations three professors, one arguing as a midpoint that it's David Tolbert, who is the president of the International Center for Transitional Justice, We had also Michael Ignatieff, who is a Canadian politician and a Harvard Law professor. And we also had the participation of the former UN High Commissioner that has been really important in this fight against impunity. So you have those three positions, basically. One arguing that we have been effective in the fight against impunity. Someone saying that we have not been that effective. And someone saying, well, basically, we have been doing our best. On the part on arguing if we have been effective or not, we have a midpoint, and the midpoint is Professor Tolbert. And Professor Tolbert is basically saying that in this fight, we have kind of a spring moment during the decade of the 19th after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Berlin Wall, and in that process, we saw an awakening. And then during the following decade after the terrorist attack of the 9/11, then some countries that lead the fight against impunity were in a kind of situation of not being that good trying to prosecute people that has been guilty of those crimes, because some of those people were involved during the conflicts, as the United States and other members of the NATO, for example. So that's basically starting point. And then you have the other two positions. First, you have someone that is saying that no, we have not been that effective in that fight. That's Michael Ignatieff that said that we have keep repeating ourselves to all the human rights defenders the same narrative that after what happened in Nuremberg, we have created these mechanisms of international accountability, if that's the word, with ad hoc courts, with international criminal courts, and that everything just has been getting better and better. And he said that's not true. We have been successful in trying to prosecute people that has been accountable for crimes against humanity or war crimes, because the interest of powerful countries has been circumstantially in the same page as the interest of justice. But that doesn't mean that if we have a case, if we are watching in Ukraine, where a powerful country has not the same interest as the justice, then we are going to be effective or successful. In the contrary, of course, we are going to fail. And that's the hard truth that we have to accept in his view, that we have to see that we have not been done successful. And the only way that international justice could be successful, it's only if we have an coincidence, a circumstantial one, between powerful countries and the interest of justice. And the last point that it's really good is the point of the UN former High Commissioner Saad al-Hussein, who said that we are watching this amount of violations in this era and believing mistakenly that there are more violations right now than in the past, because precisely we're better equipped to make documentations of the violations. We have media, we have smartphones, we can actually supervise what is happening in the field right now in Ukraine, because people have phones in their hands where they can record what is happening. So in 40 years ago, we did not have those kind of stuff. We did not have those equipment or those tools. So that reminds me pretty much of this book of Steven Pinker, who is a psychiatrist on Harvard, that said that we have been getting better because we're better equipped. Even if we are seeing situations of gross human rights violations right now, it is not true that we are not got effective, because even if criminal tribunals depend on the powerful countries, we have developed other tools within the International Human Rights Council that are also effective. So we have those three positions. I will say mine at the end, but I just want to give the audience those three different insights.
Right. Thank you very much, Gabriel, for setting the tone for this conversation. And I think that will take me to my next question, and that will bring Pietro to join this conversation. Pietro, you're a trained lawyer from Italy, and currently you've done a master's program, and now currently completing your master's program in international humanitarian law and human rights at the American University. My question for you is this: do you think there will be any kind of prosecution for the events happening in Ukraine? If there would be, what's your thoughts about the concept of individual responsibility in this ongoing tension and crisis in Ukraine? Yes, Petro?
So when we're talking about Ukraine, we need to think specifically about the fact that the ongoing events will go through a very careful investigation that will be purported by the, let's call it generally, the institution that is going to review the case. Now, the first question that we need to answer is what bodies are going to have jurisdiction over this case? And first of all, we can mention the European Court of Human Rights, which is a body that is going to definitely have jurisdiction over the matter, regardless of the intention of the Russian Federation to denounce the convention, or the fact that the Russian Federation has been expelled by the Council of Europe, which is going to take effect starting from September 16, 2022. We need to say that the jurisdiction of the court and the convention will still have effects over these facts. So the European Court of Human Rights is a first body. Also, we can mention the International Criminal Court. The main problems regarding the International Criminal Court, which is basically the main body that we can think of for the implementation of international humanitarian law and international criminal law, regards jurisdiction. And indeed, there is a problem of jurisdiction because neither Ukraine nor Russia have are party to the Rome Statute and do not recognize the jurisdiction of the ICC. But something interesting has happened because the ICC prosecutor, Mr. Karim AA Khan QC, has decided to open an investigation for the events happening right now. And Ukraine, and this on this basis, according to Article 12, Paragraph 3 of the Rome Statute, Ukraine has exercised its legal prerogatives to ask for the intervention of the ICC for what has been happening in Crimea. And in 2015 has extended this mandate basically throughout all the territory of Ukraine for the events happening from the 20th February 2014 onwards. So this is just to give a framework regarding the jurisdiction.
Right. Thank you very much, Pietro, for that. I think this will take me to my next questions. There have been several happenings in Ukraine, and over the past few weeks, and then there are questions from international humanitarian law practice, and then scholars have asked questions. Children are being killed, lives are being lost, people are being malhandled, and all of such. You, as an international lawyer, what do you think in the context of the war ongoing in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia? What crimes do you think have been committed or are still being committed during these issues in which we are having at hand now in Ukraine?
Well, this is a very interesting question because you can read all over the media that we're talking about war crimes, we're talking about violations of human rights, etc. But the thing is that we are just talking about alleged war crimes. The word war crimes cannot be expanded that easily. And according to reports of Human Rights Watch and other investigations carried out, we can say that some activities has been going on. And definitely we can talk about a lot of behaviors conducted specifically from the Russian Federations. But we do not need to forget that the international humanitarian law applies on both sides, applies on both parties to the armed conflict. So also Ukrainian forces may be liable and responsible for these crimes, for example, with the treatment of prisoners of war. But for now, the only reports that we can really find are regarding violations of Russia, which is the invading country, and we can talk about unlawful targeting of medical facilities, bombing of evacuation and humanitarian routes, which was mind-blowing, and of course, for example, the crime of aggression. Also, the recent developments with the hundreds of bodies that have been found in the northern part of Kyiv. Add to this set of violation also mass summary execution of civilians, rape of civilians, and pillage. So this is also something that is going to be taken into consideration during the prosecution of these alleged crimes.
Right. Thank you very much for that thoughts on this perspective of the question. Gabriel, I'll come back to you and want to get your thoughts on this particular line of question. I've checked your background. You seems to have very interesting career path in human rights coming from Venezuela. And now Pietro has talked about other issues of violations of rights, and then there's several happenings in Ukraine, and he has also looked at some other international instruments. Now, my question for you is this, Gabriel, what are the ways through which it's possible to combat issues of impunity within the framework of IHL? Looking at the fact that there are several international instruments to regulate conduct during armed conflict, What do you think within the framework of IHL can be used to combat the ongoing impunity in Russia? Gabriel?
Yes, I think Pietro has addressed some of them, especially for the case of Ukraine right now. European Court, I think, is going to be an important tool. However, there is this kind of body that nobody knows exists, and I don't guilt anyone about that. I don't blame anyone for that because it has never been activated, and it's the International Humanitarian Fact-Finding Commission of the Additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Convention. That is in Article 90. Uh, and you will say why this commission that it's the direct body that it's contemplated within the framework of IHL have never been activated is because the boundaries and the limits of their jurisdictional competence, and that we say it's really hard to imagine that it could be also activate during the current situation. So basically, this commission can only address situations of international armed conflict. It does not have competence for non-international armed conflicts. And even if whichever country wants to activate it, any country member of the United Nations, or I will be more specific, any country that recognize the effectiveness of the additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions could ask for an activation of the Commission. However, the two parties or more parties involved in a conflict has to give their effective consent to be object of a scrutiny under the commission. So that's basically one of the bodies that we could activate it. And then I will go back with what Pietro has already said. We have the human rights bodies, we have the European bodies. I will say that in the human rights bodies, we have the regional bodies, the Inter-American Court and the European Court. Right now, I will say that the Europeans does not have any excuse to apply IHL because for those who are not familiarized with this problem, the European Court has this case that is famous, Hassan, where they basically does not acknowledge directly that they will not be willing to apply IHL, and actually in the case of the Chechenian conflict with the Russians, they have not been that, I will say, friendly with the apply of IHL in conflicts of non-armed conflict. The last thing I would like to address is that, of course, the Inter-American Court has been more friendly, and we have another tool, a very important. There is the universal jurisdiction. Universal jurisdiction is a principle that basically challenges some of the basic criminal law principles. Normally, if you commit a crime, you are going to be prosecuted in the place where you commit that crime. Here, no matter where you commit the crime, those kind of offenses that are basically recognized in international treaties are in a level of offense to the whole humanity that we cannot tolerate as a whole community that those crimes are committed. So no matter where you commit it, you are going to be prosecuted. I will say that Spain has been famous for being engaged in important judgment. For example, it's the case of the former dictatorship of Chile, Pinochet. Other famous case took place in Jerusalem, Adolf Eichmann, that was one of the main heads of the Nazis during the Holocaust. And I will say we have really good examples of universal jurisdiction. And I will say that a lot of reforms are basically going to take place in the future. Spain has a little bit of backlash in 2009 and in 2014 doing some reforms that put some boundaries on the application of universal jurisdiction, basically establishing a principle that if there is no kind of nexus or point of connection between the jurisdiction of Spain, there is no point of activating universal jurisdiction. But I will say that since Russia seems to be not okay of judging people that has been liable for gross human rights violation and gross in observation of the Geneva Conventions, all the European countries and basically maybe the ones here in the United States or other Western countries will be more friendly with the application of the universal jurisdiction. And just to finish with this, we recently, before seeing the explosion of everything here in Ukraine, we seems that UK, a court in UK, apply extraterritorially their laws to people that has been liable for the tortures of Abu Zubaydah. For the ones who are not familiarized with the Abu Zubaydah case, it's a really famous case of one of the persons that were detained during the beginning of the Iraq conflict after 9/11, and he was detained and tortured in different facilities of the CIA in different places all around the world. And I will say it's basically impressive how UK has been so deferent in applying their own laws to this kind of context. So I will link these two concepts of extraterritorial application of law and universal jurisdiction as an alternative if the criminal courts that we have and the European courts does not work as well. Because as Pietro said, we maybe will see a denunciation of the European Convention from Putin, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be effective immediately. We will have a period of grace of 6 months. So if that happened, all the situations that are happening right now in Ukraine could be within the jurisdiction of the European Court. So that's basically my insights on the ways that this could be effective.
Right. Thank you so much, Gabriel, for sharing your very rich thoughts on that question. Yeah, for viewers who are joined online on LinkedIn, on Facebook, and on Instagram, please feel free to use this chat box. We're taking questions from our audience, and Gabriel and Pietro will be here to take your questions. Now, this will take me to Pietro. It's a very straightforward question. Who is responsible for the crimes ongoing in this country? Pietro?
So, considering that we will be talking about just the alleged crimes that have been committed by the Russian Federation, we can look at, first of all, the first personality that occupies the first place in every prosecutor list, which is who is Vladimir Putin. Then we have the chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces, Gerasimov. Then the first deputy chief of General Staff, Bogdanovsky, and I hope not to be butchering the names, the director of the Chief Intelligence Office, Kustoyev, and the commander-in-chief of the Russian Ground Forces, Sayukov. So it may be possible to reconduct the responsibilities of these violations just mentioned to these personalities. The Rome Statute is pretty informative in how to apply and in how to interpret the crimes that are described in Article 7, 8, and so these are the personalities that I would say will be under the spectrum.
Right. Thank you very much, Pietro and Gabriel, for coming on the show today. If there are no questions from the guests, I think I'll just ask Gabriel. We've looked at these violations and prosecutions, particularly looking at the case in Russia and Ukraine. What will be your final thoughts for those who are watching? What do you want them to pick up from this chat and from your response? Your final thoughts on the chat today, Gabriel?
I will say that I will go back to three positions that we saw in the ICTJ debate in 2015, where we have someone saying that we have abandoned the fight against impunity and someone saying that we has not. It's true. It's definitely true that the powerful countries design all the United Nations system to maintain a kind of they're part of the power. They won the Second World War and they have the veto and the P5 are in the Security Council. So it's naive to assume that if Russia is going to use their veto, we are going to be successful in that part. But I want to believe that we have been we acknowledge that situation from the beginning. That's why we have created all the other mechanisms, as the one, as I said, universal jurisdictions, the special mechanisms in the Human Rights Council, other documentations. The General Assembly used the pro-peace resolutions when the Security Council failed to act during situations that threat the global peace. So I will say we are definitely better equipped to fight against impunity, and we have to keep the faith in doing it, because otherwise we are going to be like waiving our right to fight against this kind of violations. So the only way to make effective IHL and human rights and everything is that we keep the faith on doing that job. And that's the way it's done. Keeping the faith. That's my final thought.
Right. Thank you so much. Pietro, what's your final thoughts on the charts today? And before your final thoughts, please, for those who have questions, you can drop your question on the chat box and we'll be able to take it before we put the show on hand. Thank you. Yeah, Pietro, your final thoughts.
So, as we have tried to show, the various mechanisms may not ensure total accountability, but it's clear that they fill the gap of accountability. And the international bodies of justice have remained silent in many cases. We can mention Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, but they work, as showed instead in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sierra Leone, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. However, the international criminal accountability system cannot be used only against African countries or areas of states on the verge of collapse. So this is an occasion for the international accountability system to hold accountable those states that may curve and may flex this kind of accountability system to their own agenda, to show that we are not bound to their agenda, to the agenda of those superpowers. And this may be actually a milestone event showing how accountability system can work also against them.
Right. Thank you very much, Pietro and Gabriel. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been speaking to these gentlemen who are lawyers in their individual field and doing so well. They've looked at the international humanitarian law with me today, violations, its prosecution, particularly on perspectives from the war happening in Ukraine. At the beginning of the chat, I said Pietro is an Italian doctor of law who graduated from Bocconi University and currently completing his LLM at the American University at the Washington College of Law. Thank you, Pietro. It's a pleasure to have you on the show today. I've also been joined by Gabriel Ortiz. Gabriel is also a lawyer and currently an assistant professor at the University of UCAB, and also has a very rich expertise in the issues of humanitarian law. Before we go, we have a question from our audience, and I'll put the question on the chat box for either of you to respond. The question is from Emmanuel Onyeche. It says, given that the US has consistently shown that IHL doesn't apply to them, take the continued incarceration of Assange as an example, is it practical to expect that Russia will be meeting any real consequences for IHL violation in Ukraine? Yes, any of you can take the question, Pietro or Gabriel.
Go ahead, Pietro. I can make some comments.
Okay. Yeah, actually, I agree with what has been said, because it has been shown a lot that the international accountability system does not apply to the superpowers, as I said at the end. But that doesn't mean that this is always going to happen. And in this case, something interesting that we may think of is the fact that there has not been any conflict recently that has galvanized the public attention like this one. So some change may be done. I cannot say that this is not going to happen. It's not my role to say what is going to happen in the future. But I will say that there are some grounds to think that some change may happen. So I don't know, but we are going to see how things develop.
What I will add, really brief, it's the international community is not monolithic. Like, all the countries has different ways to see and how to approach this kind of situation. And I really believe that the naming and shaming exercise that the countries does in the political bodies as the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council has an effect. And that effect, it matters. I will put the example of Venezuela. The International Fact-Finding Commission of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela did not prosecute directly the people that has been involved, or that the fact-finding mission has said that has been involved in crimes against humanity. But the mere fact that an international body is saying that a president of Venezuela has knowledge of the torturing of people, the extrajudicial people of killing, means a lot for the people there and means a lot for the history. So as long as the international community keep doing these bodies, actually for Ukraine, we already have a kind of international fact-finding commission that it's going to be in paper and it's going to be working. So I will say the responsibility to protect situations that are concerning the international community does not end in going there and trying to prosecute the guy. It also covers the situations where we make the documentation and we said this person is liable. And a UN body saying that, that's important and that matters. That's what I will add.
Right. Thank you so much, distinguished gentlemen. I appreciate your time on the chat today, and I look forward to staying in touch with you. Viewers, we have now come to the end of this chat, and we look forward to the next edition next week. Thank you very much, and have a good one, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Welcome to the Human Rights Café. My name is Jacob Sule. When people's rights are tampered with or denied, it means that my rights and yours are being undermined. Hence, we must educate people about their rights. The Human Rights Café is a collaborative virtual conversation of irate to live initiative to equip new generation of leaders to know, promote, and protect citizens' rights and dignity of all persons. The conversation seeks to promote human rights, justice, peace, and strong institutions as provided for by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Our goal is to build a nation where peace and justice shall reign and respect for citizens' rights. If you'd like to know more about the Human Rights Café, please join our conversation on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter via H Right Café. Once again, Jacob Sule. Thank you.